Hey guys, tonight we step into the warm mud and moonlit silence of ancient southern Mesopotamia, where reed houses lean beside canals, temple walls glow faintly in the dusk, and small clay tablets wait in the dark like stubborn little time capsules. Some parts of this story are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm. What if imagination? Because when you move through Sumerian texts about the Anunnaki and humanity's beginnings, historians debate plenty, and the clues may feel stranger the longer you sit with them. You probably would not survive this very well, by the way. Not because of cursed gods or cosmic secrets, but because the heat is brutal, the water is moody, and even your groceries depend on irrigation ditches behaving themselves. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are at it, post your location and local time down in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin with clay, not the dramatic kind glowing under thunder, not the movie version where a giant hand drops from the sky and gives a speech. But ordinary river clay, sticky underfoot, pressed into bricks, smeared onto walls, shaped into bowls, and eventually marked with signs. Most historians agree that the earliest writing in southern Mesopotamia emerged for practical reasons. Archaeology suggests that people first used signs and marks to track goods, labour, grain, oil, beer, sheep, and the endless paperwork of being human in a growing settlement. The evidence we do have points to administration before poetry, counting before philosophy, and honestly, that feels very on brand for civilization. You invent writing and almost immediately somebody wants an inventory. So before the Anunnaki become a modern mystery word, before later readers try to turn them into a hidden answer for everything from human origins to cosmic management, you are standing in a world where writing itself is young. It begins in the late 4th millennium BCE in places like Uruk, where city life is becoming more complicated, temple institutions are expanding, and the need to record resources is no longer optional. What's broadly accepted is that the earliest tablets are economic in nature. They track deliveries and obligations. They measure out grain rations and goods. They are not introducing themselves as secret diaries of the gods. And yet once writing exists, it becomes more than a counting tool. It holds myths, hymns, king lists, laments, prayers, and the deep anxiety of people trying to explain why life feels both organised and exhausting. One interpretation is that the shift from counting sheep to describing cosmic order tells you something important about ancient minds. A careful reading might suggest that administration and mythology were never far apart. In a temple economy, the practical and the sacred sit at the same table and share the same bread. The same hand that records barley might also copy a story about divine intention. What if the story is pointing at something else, not a single hidden truth, not a dramatic reveal with thunder drums and a thumbnail face frozen in shock? We are not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You walk a little farther into the old city. The air smells of mudbrick, water plants, animal dung, and baking bread. It is not glamorous. Ancient Mesopotamia rarely is. This is one of the reasons it feels so compelling. Most historians agree that Sumerian civilization arose in an environment that demanded cooperation. Southern Mesopotamia had rich alluvial soil, but it also had unpredictable rivers, intense heat, and few natural resources like stone or timber. Archaeology suggests that irrigation systems, labour organisation, and temple-centred administration were crucial to making large settlements possible. In other words, civilization is happening because people are very busy trying not to starve in a swamp with ambition. That practical setting matters when you later encounter stories about gods creating humans for work. A more cautious explanation could be that these myths reflect the world that produced them. If society depends on labour, then myths may naturally imagine labour as cosmic too. If fields must be maintained, canals cleared, offerings prepared, and temples staffed, then a story about humans being created to serve divine needs starts sounding less like a coded alien memo and more like a theological mirror of real social structure. Still, the mystery has a pulse. The later myths do not feel like spreadsheets. They feel heavier than that. Even in translation, they seem to breathe a little. They carry that old Near Eastern habit of making everything bigger than life while keeping it strangely domestic. Gods get tired. Gods argue. Gods assign tasks. The universe at moments feels less like a perfect machine and more like a household where someone forgot to label the storage jars. Historians still argue whether the oldest creation traditions preserve memories of social realities, ritual symbolism, or something more poetic and abstract about the human condition. There's no full consensus, and that is part of what keeps these texts alive. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. A broken tablet line can leave more room for imagination than a polished monument ever could. The Anunnaki enter this atmosphere gradually in the modern imagination, but in the actual ancient material things are more textured. What's broadly accepted is that the term refers to a group of deities in Mesopotamian tradition, especially in Sumerian and Akkadian contexts, though their role can shift depending on the text and period. They are not introduced with a neat character bio and a helpful little subtitle saying, "Hello, we are definitely this one thing." Ancient religion is rude like that. It leaves you with fragments overlapping traditions and enough ambiguity to keep translators humble for generations. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were literal advanced beings who engineered humanity for labour. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because it gives modern readers a dramatic answer to an ancient question. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still be useful in one narrow way. It reminds you how powerful these old stories still feel. They continue to invite explanation because they speak in images that are both simple and unnerving: clay, blood, toil, order, rebellion, purpose. But the evidence we do have points first to scribe cities and tradition. Long before anybody on the internet decided an ancient deity sounded like a project manager from the stars, real scribes were pressing wedges into wet clay under the authority of the institutions that cared very much about memory, ritual and control. Most historians agree that scribal culture mattered enormously in preserving Mesopotamian literature. These stories survive because generations of trained writers copied them. That means the texts are not raw voices from the dawn of time. They are curated, taught, recited, edited and shaped by human hands over centuries. Let me rephrase that more carefully. When we read a Sumerian or Akkadian creation account, we are not hearing a single original voice whispering directly across 5,000 years. We are hearing a tradition. That's a possibility, not a certainty about every line, but it is the safest footing we have. The tablets may preserve very old ideas, yet they come to us through layers of copying and interpretation. The clay holds the marks, but history holds the fingerprints. So tonight you sit at the beginning of the puzzle with a city rising from mud, writing emerging from necessity, and myths beginning to gather around power, labour and divine order. Most historians agree that the first tablets were practical. One interpretation is that once writing matured, it became a place where societies explained not only what they owned, but why they existed. And what if tucked inside that long movement from rationalist to creation story, there lingers a deeper unease about humanity itself, not who made us in a literal sense, but why any civilization keeps needing to tell itself a story about being made at all. You keep moving through the low shimmering world of southern Mesopotamia, and the land itself starts to explain why cities appear so early, so densely, and with such stubborn determination. Most historians agree that the great Sumerian settlements did not rise because the environment was easy. They rose because people learnt very carefully and over generations how to negotiate with a difficult one. Archaeology suggests that the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates offered fertile soil, but only if water could be directed, controlled and persuaded to arrive at the right time, instead of behaving like an offended house cat. Too little water and crops fail, too much water and the fields drown. Civilization here is less a graceful bloom than a long sweaty argument with geography. You stand at the edge of an early city, perhaps Uruk, in its broad historical outline, though no one can hand you a perfect postcard view. What's broadly accepted is that by the 4th millennium, BCE settlements in southern Mesopotamia were becoming impressively large and complex. Monumental buildings rise, temple precincts grow, specialised labour appears, trade networks stretch outward. Administration becomes serious business, which is a polite way of saying someone somewhere has decided your grain absolutely must be counted twice. The evidence we do have points to a world where city life requires coordination on a scale that village memory alone can no longer manage. And so the city becomes more than walls and houses. It becomes a system. Canals feed fields. Storehouses collect goods. Priests and officials oversee rituals and resources. Workers haul mudbrick, shape pottery, tend animals, weave textiles and drag materials through heat that would make your modern weather app simply give up. Most historians agree that irrigation agriculture played a central role in supporting these dense populations. Archaeology suggests that canal networks and managed fields were essential, even if scholars still debate exactly how centralised or locally organised those systems were in every period. Historians still argue whether the earliest temple institutions were primarily religious centres that accumulated economic power, or economic centres that expressed that power through religion. Either way, the god gets the shrine and somebody else gets the shovel. This is where the atmosphere of the later myths begins to make more sense. One interpretation is that when Sumerian and Akkadian texts describe gods, ordering work, establishing cities, and assigning functions, they are reflecting the lived experience of a people surrounded by organised labour. A careful reading might suggest that divine order is not floating above urban life like a decorative cloud. It is woven directly into it. In a place where survival depends on coordinated effort, the cosmos itself starts to look bureaucratic. Even heaven may need a supervisor, a schedule, and one exhausted underling pretending everything is fine. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the earliest cities do not just form the backdrop for the myths, but shape the emotional logic of them? That's not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. But it is possible that as cities expanded, the question of why humans exist became sharper, not softer. In a small community, you may know your role because everyone knows your face. In a huge settlement with labour-divided rations distributed and temples towering over daily life, purpose can start to feel assigned from above. That does not mean the Anunnaki are secret historical overlords. A more cautious explanation could be that divine hierarchies in myth mirror institutional hierarchies on the ground. The city itself encourages this feeling. You move through narrow lanes where mudbrick walls hold the day's heat long into the evening. You hear donkeys, traders, children distant chanting, the slosh of water lifted in containers, and somewhere the soft scrape of reed mats against plaster. This is not a romantic ruin yet. It is alive, loud, and very invested in barley. Most historians agree that grain production underpinned the economy of early Mesopotamia, and archaeology suggests that bread and beer were central staples of daily life. Civilization, once again, is built on surprisingly familiar priorities. We call it the cradle of civilization, but half the time It is also the cradle of administrative snacks. As the cities grow, so does sacred architecture. The temple precinct matters because it is not merely a place for prayer in the modern private sense. What's broadly accepted is that temples in Mesopotamia often functioned as economic ritual and symbolic centres. They stored goods, employed workers, coordinated offerings, and marked the place where divine and civic order overlapped. One interpretation is that this overlap helps explain why myths about creation feel so practical. Humans are not imagined simply as contemplative beings wandering through a spiritual garden, admiring sunsets, and inventing poetry on weekends. They are often imagined in relation to service maintenance offerings and order. That does not make the texts dull. Quite the opposite. It gives them that wonderfully ancient mix of cosmic seriousness and domestic realism. The gods in many Mesopotamian traditions are grand, but they are also strangely familiar in their needs and complaints. They inhabit a universe where work has to be done, where food offerings matter, where disorder is a real threat. If later readers feel a jolt when they encounter the idea that humanity was created for labour, that jolt may come from how bluntly the old stories say what many societies only imply. You are here to keep things running. Congratulations. The universe has turned you into unpaid seasonal staff. A popular rumour claims that such myths must preserve a hidden memory of literal creators who engineered humans for service. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because the language of labour in ancient texts can sound startlingly direct. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the interesting question becomes not whether the rumour is true, but why the rumour feels tempting. One reason may be that the mythic language fits modern anxieties almost too well. Work hierarchy, obligation, and the suspicion that somebody else wrote the rules before you got here. Ancient Mesopotamia is very old, but emotionally it can feel annoyingly current. Most historians agree, however, that the rise of cities is better explained through archaeology, environment, economics, and social development than through hidden intervention. The evidence we do have points to gradual change over long spans of time, not a sudden scripted insertion of civilization from outside history. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Still, the mist has charm. What if, as temples rose over the floodplain, and scribes pressed signs into clay, people themselves began to feel that the city had demands beyond mere survival? What if urban life made human purpose feel less natural and more assigned, as though somewhere above the lanes and canals an invisible ledger was being kept? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. What's documented is that Sumerian cities emerged through organised labour, irrigation, and institutional growth. What may be interpreted is that their myths transformed those realities into stories of divine command. And what if the city, with all its noise and order and hot brick breathing into the dusk, became the first great machine that taught people to imagine themselves as necessary parts inside a system designed by powers they could name, worship, fear, but never fully question? The city stays with you even as the stories lift their eyes toward the gods, because in Mesopotamia, the distance between heaven and administration is often smaller than you might hope. You look up from the dust and canals and ration jars, and suddenly the divine world begins to resemble a court, a council, a hierarchy of beings with titles, authority, duties, and moods. Most historians agree that Sumerian religion was polytheistic, with major deities associated with cities, natural forces, kingship, fertility, wisdom, storm, and cosmic order. What's broadly accepted is that these gods were not abstract philosophical principles in the way later traditions sometimes imagine divinity. They were active, personal, and tied to institutions, landscapes, and communities. Their temples stood in cities, because their power was thought to shape the life of those cities. That is where the Anunnaki begin to matter, though not yet in the neat internet-ready form that later fascination prefers. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian texts use divine groups in shifting ways, and the Anunnaki are one of those groups whose identity and role change depending on time, place, and language. In some traditions they are high-ranking deities, in others connected with underworld judgment, and in still others they simply appear as part of a larger divine assembly. The evidence we do have points to complexity, not a single tidy definition. Ancient religion once again declines to provide a customer service desk. One interpretation is that this fluidity is exactly why the Anunnaki became such an inviting mystery later on. If a divine group appears in different settings and seems to hover near questions of authority, order, and judgment, modern readers naturally start reaching for a hidden pattern. A careful reading might suggest that the Anunnaki function less like named individuals in a modern narrative, and more like a category of elevated power. They are part of the architecture of myth. They make the divine world feel structured, ranked, and official. Even the gods, it seems, have meetings. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths often portray the divine realm in ways that echo human political life. The gods deliberate, command, assign reward, punish, and occasionally sound like they need a nap. This is not unique to Mesopotamia, but it is especially striking there because the city-state world is so deeply woven into ritual and writing. One interpretation is that divine kingship mirrors earthly kingship, or perhaps the other way around. A more cautious explanation could be that both develop together, reinforcing one another. If rulers govern from palaces and temples, then stories of heaven may naturally take on the same form. If the social world is hierarchical, the cosmos may look hierarchical too. Historians still argue whether the gods in early Sumerian literature are best understood as personified forces of nature, civic patrons shaped by political development, or theological beings with older roots that predate the cities themselves. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty matters. It reminds you that these traditions were not invented all at once by one committee in matching robes. They grew over time. Local traditions blended, languages shifted, Sumerian and Akkadian materials interacted. Stories were copied, adapted, and reimagined. The result is not a locked box with one key, but a room full of overlapping voices. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if beneath the official roles of the gods, there lingers a more human memory about authority itself? That's a possibility, not a certainty. But when you read about divine councils, about high-ranking powers who set the terms of existence, it is difficult not to feel the emotional truth inside the symbolism. Human beings often experience power as distant, elevated, and slightly mysterious. Orders come down from above. Rules are given. Work is assigned. Reasons are not always explained. One interpretation is that the gods of Mesopotamia reflect not only cosmic imagination, but the lived sensation of being governed. That does not mean the Anunnaki were actual rulers, later exaggerated into gods. Most historians agree that there is no mainstream evidence for that conclusion. The evidence we do have points to mythic and religious tradition, not disguised political biography. Still, a fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki preserve a memory of real beings, perhaps powerful outsiders, perhaps something stranger, who were later transformed into divine figures. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has a certain dramatic charm because it offers a simple answer to a complicated archive. People do love a clean solution, especially when the actual evidence arrives in fragments, damaged lines, and a translation footnote, quietly having a nervous breakdown. A more cautious explanation could be that divine language became the natural way to talk about forces larger than ordinary life. Storms, kingship, fertility, war, abundance, law, death, and the stability of the city all required explanation. Gods provided that explanation, and the Anunnaki in some contexts helped express the idea that power itself had levels and ranks. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian religion did not sharply divide sacred and political life. The city belonged to its god. The temple anchored communal identity. The ruler's legitimacy often stood in relation to divine favour. In such a world, heavenly government and earthly government are not separate buildings across town. They are next-door neighbours borrowing each other's furniture. You can feel it in the stories. Even when the myths become grand, they rarely drift completely away from work status, obligation and order. The gods are not merely there to inspire awe. They regulate reality. They decide things. They are in their own mythic fashion administrators of being. This is why later creation stories will matter so much. If the universe is governed through hierarchy, then the question of humanity's purpose becomes unavoidable. Where do you fit in this arrangement? Are you a beloved creation, a ritual servant, a cosmic afterthought, a necessary worker in a divine economy? The old texts do not always answer gently. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. What's documented is that Mesopotamian texts present a structured divine world, and that the Anunnaki belong within that religious framework. What may be interpreted is how much these divine structures reflect human social experience. And what if the image of heavenly authority mattered so deeply because it gave ancient people a way to think about power without ever quite pinning it down? The same way you can hear the creak of a temple door at night and feel that something important is inside, even if you cannot yet see the room. So you keep walking with the city behind you, and the gods now overhead, not as aliens in a machine shop, not as cartoon villains with a labour shortage, but as figures in a very old attempt to map order onto the world. Most historians agree that the myths arise from religious and social life in Mesopotamia. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki became memorable because they sit where authority becomes mysterious. And what if that is why their name still lingers? Because once a culture imagines a council above the sky, deciding who does what below it, the question of why humanity exists begins to sound less like philosophy and more like a summons. That summons grows quieter and stranger as you move deeper into the old creation stories, because now the language shifts from cities and councils to bodies, substance, and the unsettling intimacy of being made. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian creation traditions include images of humans formed from clay, with divine involvement giving that clay life purpose or identity. What's broadly accepted is that this imagery appears across related traditions in different forms, especially in later Akkadian material, shaped by older Sumerian ideas. Archaeology suggests that clay was the obvious material of life in southern Mesopotamia. It built the house, sealed the jar, shaped the tablet, lined the wall, and stuck stubbornly to your feet, like the world refusing to let you leave. So when ancient people imagined human origins in clay, they were not reaching for an exotic symbol. They were reaching for the thing already in their hands. And yet, the image still lands with force. You are shaped from mud, but not merely mud. You are ordinary earth touched by something beyond itself. One interpretation is that this makes humanity both humble and elevated at once. A careful reading might suggest that the point is not biological explanation in any modern sense, but status. Humans belong to the world of labour decay and material need. Yet they also carry some spark of divine purpose, however uneasily defined. The old myths rarely flatter you for long. They give you dignity, then hand you a job. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian people were not trying to write laboratory accounts of human origins. These are myths in the serious ancient sense stories that explain order, duty, suffering, and relationship. What's broadly accepted is that they answer questions modern people still ask, though, with very different assumptions. Why are humans here? Why is work necessary? Why do the gods demand offerings? Why is life structured by obligation? A more cautious explanation could be that clay imagery expresses dependence itself. You come from the same stuff as the walls and fields, shaped by powers greater than you, vulnerable to cracking if neglected. Not exactly a motivational poster, but honest. Historians still argue whether the clay motif should be read primarily as a symbol of mortality, a reflection of craft production, a ritual image of formation, or a poetic way of linking humanity to the cultivated land. There's no full consensus. Some scholars emphasize environmental familiarity. Others focus on religious symbolism. Still others note how common fashioned earth imagery can be across ancient cultures. The evidence we do have points to several layers working at once. That often happens in myth. One symbol does not do one job. It holds many meanings the way a riverbank holds footprints, reed roots and broken pots, all in the same mud. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the clay image feels so powerful because it quietly links creation with writing itself? That is not a certainty, and the evidence is thin, so we should say so. But it is possible that in a culture where memory is pressed into clay tablets, the idea of life formed from clay carries an extra resonance. The same material that stores the story also becomes the substance of the creature inside the story. You are made of the thing that records you. It is a little poetic, a little eerie, and frankly, ancient Mesopotamia did not have to go that hard, but here we are. One interpretation is that this deepens the question of purpose. If humanity is formed from clay by divine intention, then people are not simply alive. They are assigned. A careful reading might suggest that the myth is less concerned with how you came into existence than with why your existence is structured the way it is. Why do humans work, worship, suffer, marry, bury, build, and obey? Why are people always caught between appetite and duty? Why does civilization feel like a beautifully organized inconvenience? The myth does not offer modern freedom. It offers placement. Most historians agree that the image of divine breath or divine activation of formed matter belongs to a widespread ancient way of imagining life. In Mesopotamian tradition, the exact mechanisms vary by text, but what's broadly accepted is that humans are not self-originating beings in these stories. They require divine action. One interpretation is that this action symbolizes dependence on sacred order. Another is that it reflects the social world of temple life, where the gods are treated as living presences whose favour sustains the city. A more cautious explanation could be that the myth simply insists that life itself remains mysterious. Clay is familiar, animation is not. The gap between the two is where religion begins to hum. A popular rumour claims that the combination of clay and divine essence in later Mesopotamian stories hints at some forgotten act of engineering, as though the text preserves an encoded memory of designed humanity. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because the language of mixing materials and imparting life can sound uncannily technical to modern ears. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more useful observation is that ancient myth often sounds stranger when read through modern expectations. The problem may not be that the text is hiding a machine. The problem may be that we are so used to sterile explanations that symbolic language suddenly feels suspicious. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The myths may feel vivid enough to invite literal readings, but vividness is not proof. That's a possibility, not a certainty. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is this Mesopotamian creation stories use clay and divine agency to describe humanity's beginning in ways tied to religious imagination and social meaning. The mist is everything added later by readers who want the story to behave like a leaked memo from a secret workshop. Still, the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Why does the image persist so strongly across time? Why does being shaped from earth still feel emotionally plausible, even to people who do not take the myth literally? One interpretation is that it speaks to a truth beneath facts. You are fragile, formed, dependent, and temporary. You dry out. You crack. You return to dust. But for a while you move, speak, remember, and ask inconvenient questions. The old story gives that condition a maker. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. What's documented is that Mesopotamian traditions imagined humanity being fashioned from clay with divine involvement. What may be interpreted is whether that image reflects mortality, labour, sacred order, or all three at once. And what if the ancient scribe pressing marks into a wet tablet understood something? You can still feel in your fingertips tonight that clay is never just dirt in this world. It is house record, offering, wall body, and the quiet material from which an entire civilization keeps remaking itself. And once you have been shaped from clay and placed beneath the eyes of the gods, the next question arrives with almost embarrassing speed. What exactly are you supposed to do all day? Ancient Mesopotamian myth is not shy about this. Most historians agree that daily life in Sumer revolved around agriculture, irrigation, food production, craftwork, and the maintenance of the institutions that held the city together. Archaeology suggests that grain was central, canals were essential, and labour was the thread tying almost everything to everything else. Bread beer, brick baskets, reeds, animals, ploughs, storage jars, temple offerings, house repairs, and endless field work all belong to the normal rhythm of life. Civilization, in other words, is not just a brilliant leap of culture. It is also a very long to-do list. You can feel that immediately when you step out beyond the city edges into the fields. The air turns brighter and meaner. The earth is fertile, yes, but only after work. Most historians agree that southern Mesopotamia depended on managed agriculture in an environment where water had to be directed with care. Archaeology suggests that canals, levees, and field systems made large-scale food production possible, though scholars continue to debate exactly how centralised all of that management was in different places and periods. Historians still argue whether the labour demands of irrigation were mostly coordinated by temple institutions, local households, civic authorities, or some shifting combination of all three. What's broadly accepted is simpler. The work had to happen, and a lot of people had to do it. That practical reality matters because later myths about human creation for labour do not emerge from nowhere. One interpretation is that these stories dramatise the social truth of the floodplain. Life here is sustained through repeated effort, and effort is never fully finished. A canal cleared this month silts up again. A field prepared now must be watched later. A wall patched today cracks tomorrow. Ancient Mesopotamia is a masterpiece of persistence. It is also the place where the sentence "just one quick task" goes to die. So when texts from the broader Mesopotamian tradition imagine a world in which divine beings seek relief from labour, the idea lands inside an already labour-heavy culture. What's broadly accepted is that myths like Atrahasis, which we will reach more directly, soon frame human creation in relation to work. A more cautious explanation could be that these myths express in sacred language the economic and social realities of the people who told them. If your society runs on coordinated labour, then it makes sense that your mythology gives labour cosmic significance. One interpretation is that humanity's burden becomes easier to accept if it is placed inside a story of divine order. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the old myth is not only explaining why people work, but why work feels so strangely inescapable? That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it lingers. The daily life of Sumer is full of tasks that are both ordinary and enormous. You grind grain until your shoulders burn. You haul water. You shape mudbrick. You weed fields. You mend nets. You carry baskets of earth. You tally supplies. You bake bread. You offer food to gods, whose statues in ritual understanding require care, as though divine order itself has a household appetite. Most historians agree that temple institutions employed and organised significant labour, and archaeology suggests that rations of grain and beer were part of how work was supported and distributed. The evidence we do have points to a world where labour is material, visible and deeply structured. That structure may help explain the emotional force of creation myths. A careful reading might suggest that the line between divine service and social obligation is very thin. In a temple-centred world, to work is often directly or indirectly to uphold sacred order. The field feeds the family, the institution and the gods. The offering links kitchen to shrine. The canal links labourer to city survival. Work is not just personal survival, it is participation in a system that claims moral and cosmic weight. A fringe idea proposes that such myths preserve the memory of literal beings who created humans as workers for an imposed project. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has a strange appeal because the old texts can sound blunt. Humans are made and then they serve. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more grounded observation is that the myth understands something enduring about civilization. Complex societies often justify labour by making it feel necessary, natural or sacred. Ancient Mesopotamia simply says the quiet part out loud with better pottery. Most historians agree that ordinary people in Sumerian cities and countryside lived close to subsistence, even if social status varied widely. Archaeology suggests that diets centred on barley products dates onions, legumes and beer, with access to meat more limited for many households. Houses were built of mudbrick. Tools were practical. Life expectancy was not generous by modern standards. Disease injury, crop failure and flooding were real threats. You probably would not survive this very elegantly. You would spend one afternoon trying to look wise in a reed hat, and by sunset you would be emotionally defeated by irrigation maintenance. And still, people built remarkable cultures there. That is the other side of the burden. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamia produced urban planning, legal traditions, literature, mathematics, and monumental religion within this world of hard labour. One interpretation is that the very heaviness of daily work made questions of purpose more urgent. Why are we doing all of this? Why must life be maintained with such effort? Why does order require so much carrying, cleaning, counting and kneeling? A more cautious explanation could be that myths of creation for labour gave suffering a framework. Not comfort exactly, more like explanation. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know labour mattered. We know irrigation mattered. We know temples and households depended on repeated human effort. What we cannot confirm is exactly how each ancient listener felt hearing a myth that linked humanity's origin to service. Did it sound honourable, bitter, obvious, poetic? Did it feel like truth, like theology, or like the oldest workplace memo in history? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. What's documented is that Sumerian life was built on grain water, control institutions, and exhausting work. What may be interpreted is that myths about humanity's purpose grew naturally out of that setting. And what if, under the hot sky of the floodplain, with mud on your legs and barley dust in your throat, the deepest question was never how people were made, but why a world so dependent on human hands kept telling stories that those hands were expected from the very beginning. Those hands keep working while the names of the gods gather more weight, and now the Anunnaki move closer to the centre of the room, though not in the way modern mystery culture usually prefers. Most historians agree that the Anunnaki belong to the world of Mesopotamian religion, as a group of deities, not as a neatly defined caste with one stable role across every text. What's broadly accepted is that their identity shifts depending on period language and literary setting. In some traditions they appear as powerful divine figures associated with the high gods. In others they take on more shadowed roles, especially in underworld contexts. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian religion developed over long spans of time, with Sumerian and Akkadian traditions overlapping, blending and changing. So if you were hoping the tablets would hand you a laminated badge explaining exactly who the Anunnaki are, ancient scribes have other plans. That shifting role is important because one interpretation is that the mystery surrounding the Anunnaki today comes partly from the flexibility they already had in antiquity. A careful reading might suggest that they are less like individual characters in a modern fantasy series and more like a rank, a category, or a divine stratum inside a larger sacred order. The evidence we do have points to a heavenly society with layers, responsibilities, and authority distributed across many beings. Mesopotamian myth is rarely interested in reducing complexity just to make your late-night browsing easier. What's broadly accepted is that divine assemblies mattered in Mesopotamian thought. The gods were often imagined in collective terms with councils, deliberations, and hierarchies. Most historians agree that this mirrors broader patterns in ancient Near Eastern religion, where divine power is structured rather than solitary. One interpretation is that such structures reflect human political life. If cities have rulers, priests, officials, and labourers, the heavens may be imagined the same way. A more cautious explanation could be that humans tend to picture cosmic order using the social forms they know best. If the world feels governed, then mythology will eventually furnish a government. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki were primarily understood as descendants of a chief god, as a council of great deities, or as a more fluid divine grouping whose meaning changed with literary tradition. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty matters. It reminds you that the ancient material is not one single system frozen in time. It is a library grown over centuries, full of repeated names, adjusted roles, local emphases and scribes, doing their careful best with inherited tradition. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Sometimes the same divine name survives, while its function shifts, which is either deeply profound or the theological equivalent of changing departments without updating your email signature. You can feel the effect of that fluidity when later readers try to pin the Anunnaki down as the hidden explanation for humanity's origin. A fringe idea proposes that they were literal advanced beings who came to Earth, organised labour, and created humans for practical service. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because it turns ambiguity into plot. It gives the tablets a modern rhythm. Powerful entities arrive, a workforce is needed, humans appear, mystery solved, simple, dramatic, slightly suspicious, in the way anything simple becomes when it is explaining one of the oldest questions in history. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more useful question is why the theory keeps resurfacing. One interpretation is that modern people are unusually drawn to explanations that make divine language sound technological. Councils become command structures. Creation becomes engineering. Sacred order becomes management. The Anunnaki are pulled out of religion and made to sound like executives with a staffing crisis. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That reading tells you more about modern habits of imagination than about what Mesopotamian believers themselves most likely meant. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it fits the pattern. We often translate old mysteries into the language our own age finds plausible. Most historians agree that in mainstream scholarship, the Anunnaki are best understood within Mesopotamian religious tradition, not as hidden visitors hiding behind myth. Archaeology suggests that their significance belongs to ritual texts, literary compositions, and theological frameworks that were meaningful within ancient culture. The evidence we do have points to context. Remove the Anunnaki from temple life, scribal education, divine kingship, and mythic language, and they stop being Mesopotamian. They become a modern costume stitched onto an old name. Still, old names can carry strange power. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the Anunnaki matter not because they were one single thing, but because they occupy the place where authority becomes difficult to see clearly? That is not a claim of secret history. It is an interpretation. In story after story, human beings seem aware that life is shaped by powers above them, yet those powers are rarely described in a way that settles every question. The Anunnaki fit that mood perfectly. They are elevated, collective, important, and just elusive enough to feel like the right symbol for a world where order exists but never arrives with full transparency. A popular rumour claims that ancient people preserved more knowledge than we now admit, and that names like the Anunnaki are fragments of that lost memory. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because fragments are suggestive by nature. Broken tablets invite projection. Damaged lines create space for confidence that the evidence itself does not always justify. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here often it is thinner than the dramatic versions allow. What's broadly accepted is not a hidden empire in the sky, but an old religious vocabulary trying to speak about rank, judgment, power, and divine order. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. What's documented is that the Anunnaki appear in Mesopotamian literature as a significant but shifting group of deities. What may be interpreted is why their identity remained flexible, and why later readers found that flexibility irresistible. And what if their real power lies not in being a secret answer, but in being the perfect ancient reminder that human beings have always suspected there are structures above them, shaping the terms of life while leaving just enough uncertainty to keep the imagination awake long after the lamps burn low. That uncertainty follows you into one of the most discussed ancient stories of all, because now the old question sharpens into something almost uncomfortably direct. If the gods are powerful, if the world is structured, if labour sits at the centre of life, then why were humans created at all? Most historians agree that the Atrahasis tradition preserved in Akkadian, but shaped by older Mesopotamian ideas, contains one of the clearest ancient accounts linking human creation to divine labour problems. What's broadly accepted is that the story describes lesser gods growing weary of work, rebelling against their burden, and humanity being created as a solution. Archaeology suggests that this text belongs to a long scribal tradition and survives in copies from later periods, not as a single untouched original. So already before the mystery deepens, you are dealing with layered transmission, inherited storytelling. And the usual ancient habit of making one cosmic problem sounds suspiciously like a staffing issue. You can almost picture it. The gods have fields, canals, maintenance, and responsibilities. The younger or lesser divine workers are exhausted. They complain. They refuse. There is tension in heaven, which is somehow both mythically grand and exactly like every workplace where management keeps promising just one more busy season. Most historians agree that this narrative is not a modern fantasy invention. The evidence we do have points to a real Mesopotamian mythic structure in which divine labour becomes intolerable and human beings are made to assume the burden. That much is strong ground. What does it mean? Historians still argue whether the story should be read mainly as theology, social allegory, political symbolism, or some combination of all three. There's no full consensus, and this is where the text becomes especially alive. One interpretation is that Atrahasis dramatizes the labour realities of Mesopotamian society. A careful reading might suggest that the gods in revolt mirror human workers under pressure, while the creation of humanity offers a sacred explanation for why toil exists at all. A more cautious explanation could be that the story simply uses familiar social tensions to tell a broader myth about order restored through this substitution. Either way, the burden does not disappear. It changes hands. That transfer matters. In the story's logic, humans do not appear first as philosophers, kings, or dreamers. They appear as a practical answer to a divine problem. Most historians agree that this is one of the most striking elements of Mesopotamian creation tradition. What's broadly accepted is that humanity's role in Atrahasis is service. Not necessarily joyless slavery in every emotional sense modern readers project onto it, but certainly labour with a purpose beyond individual self-fulfilment. Ancient myth is not especially invested in telling you to follow your passion. Ancient myth is far more likely to hand you a basket and point at a canal. One interpretation is that this bluntness is exactly why the story still unsettles people. It names a possibility many cultures soften. Human life may be bound up with work not as an accident, but as a defining condition. In a temple economy where offerings, crop storage, and institutions all depend on repeated effort, such a story would not feel abstract. It would feel legible. The evidence we do have points to societies where labour was organised, tracked, and deeply necessary. A careful reading might suggest that Atrahasis turns that reality into sacred narrative, so that social order feels woven into cosmic order. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the tale is not only about work, but about delegation of suffering? That is a possibility, not a certainty, but it gives the myth a darker depth. The gods do not eliminate toil, they relocate it. In that sense, the story may reflect a world where hierarchy functions by moving burden downward. That is not unusual in human history, of course. It is almost boringly familiar. But the myth gives the process a cosmic frame. One interpretation is that this makes social inequality feel older, deeper, and harder to question, because it becomes part of the architecture of existence itself. A fringe idea proposes that Atrahasis preserves a literal memory of engineered workers created by superior beings. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because the story's structure feels so startlingly functional. There is a labour problem. A new labour force is produced. Mystery enthusiasts hear that and immediately start dusting off the word design. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more grounded point is that ancient myth often uses efficient task-oriented logic when explaining the world. It does not mean the text is hiding a blueprint. It may simply mean the people who told the story lived in a society where practical needs shaped imagination at every level. Most historians agree that Atrahasis also raises questions about noise population and divine human tension in later parts of the narrative. Archaeology suggests that over time, Mesopotamian traditions developed recurring concerns about order breaking down when human life becomes too numerous or disruptive. The evidence we do have points to a worldview where creation is useful but not uncomplicated. Humanity is needed yet also troublesome, helpful yet noisy, necessary yet dangerous in excess, which, to be fair, is also how many people feel after hosting relatives for 3 consecutive days. That complexity keeps the story from being a simple labour myth. One interpretation is that Atrahasis captures an uneasy bargain. Humans relieve divine burden, but their presence introduces new problems. A more cautious explanation could be that the myth reflects real anxieties of urban society, crowding dependence, vulnerability, and the fear that the systems holding everything together are always under strain. Historians still argue whether these themes arose mainly from environmental pressures, political experience, or literary tradition, but what's broadly accepted is that the text treats human existence as useful and precarious, at the same time. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. What's documented is that Atrahasis links human creation to divine labour and presents humanity as a solution to cosmic burden. What may be interpreted is whether that story reflects social hierarchy, ritual, obligation, political thought, or all of them together. And what if, beneath the official surface of the myth, there lingers the oldest uneasy question of civilization itself, not merely why you were made, but whether purpose was ever meant to feel comforting when the story begins with someone else trying to set down the work. That work does not vanish once humanity enters the picture. It settles into the body itself, and now the story turns even stranger because, in Mesopotamian tradition, the making of humans is not always just clay and command. Sometimes it includes blood or the essence of a sacrificed divine being, and that detail gives the old myth a quiet shiver that still reaches across the centuries. Most historians agree that in the Atrahasis tradition, humanity is fashioned from clay mixed with the flesh or blood of a slain god. What's broadly accepted is that this element belongs to the literary and religious logic of the myth, not to a scientific explanation of origins. Archaeology suggests that the story survives through a scribal tradition that carefully preserved its dramatic structure, even as copies and context changed over time. So the image comes to you not as a raw secret, but as a polished piece of ancient storytelling with a very sharp edge. You can feel why it lingered. Clay alone makes humanity earthy, fragile, and practical. Clay with divine blood or divine substance makes humanity complicated. One interpretation is that this image gives humans a double inheritance. You belong to the world below, but you also carry something of the world above. A careful reading might suggest that the myth is explaining not only why people work, but why they think rebel worship dream, and disturb the order they were made to maintain. The old story does not quite flatter you, but it refuses to reduce you to mud with a pulse. You are burdened matter with a divine complication mixed in which is honestly a pretty elegant summary of the human condition. Most historians agree that ancient creation myths often use dramatic materials to explain the status of human beings. What's broadly accepted is that blood in Mesopotamian literature can signify life, vitality, kinship obligation, or sacred force depending on context. One interpretation is that the killing of a god in the creation process signals the cost of order. Humanity emerges not from effortless design, but from conflict, sacrifice, and transfer. A more cautious explanation could be that the story uses divine substance as a way to explain why humans can serve the gods, while also standing apart from animals and objects. If you're going to spend your whole life bringing offerings to temples, somebody somewhere may wish to reassure you that you are not just another storage jar with legs. Historians still argue whether this divine ingredient should be understood mainly as a symbolic marker of life, as a theological explanation for intelligence and spiritual capacity, or as part of a larger mythic pattern where order is born from disruption. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is worth keeping. The evidence we do have points to several plausible layers. The myth may be talking about vitality, it may be talking about service, it may be talking about the uneasy closeness between humans and gods. It may be doing all of these at once because ancient stories are rarely interested in behaving like tidy modern essays. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the mixing of clay and divine essence is not trying to explain biology at all, but contradiction? That is a possibility, not a certainty, but it feels worth sitting with. Humans in Mesopotamian literature are useful but unruly, reverent but noisy, dependent but ambitious, mortal yet strangely hard to manage. One interpretation is that the myth accounts for this by giving humanity a split nature. The clay explains your limits. The divine element explains why you keep looking up, asking questions, writing poems, building towers, and making situations far more complicated than they needed to be. This is where modern speculative readings often rush in. A fringe idea proposes that the combination of earthly material and divine substance preserves a coded memory of some kind of engineered hybrid creation. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains attractive because the myth sounds eerily procedural when stripped of its religious context. A material is mixed, a life form is produced, a function is assigned. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the stronger lesson is probably this symbolic language can begin to sound technical when you no longer share the symbolic world that produced it. The problem may not be that the ancient scribe was secretly describing a laboratory. The problem may be that modern readers sometimes panic when myth refuses to stay decorative. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The image is powerful because it collapses distance. Divine and human are not kept in separate locked cabinets. They are mixed. That's a possibility, not a certainty about every theological implication, but it is plainly part of the story's force. The evidence we do have points to a worldview where creation involves connection, and connection involves obligation. If humans contain something linked to the gods, then service is not merely external duty, it is woven into what they are. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion treated offerings, rituals, and temple service as real exchanges that sustained divine-human relations. Archaeology suggests that temples functioned as places where this relationship was enacted materially through food, incense, textiles, vessels, and performance. One interpretation is that the creation myth helps explain why such exchange matters. Humans are not random spectators in the cosmos. They are participants in a relationship that begins at their making. A more cautious explanation could be that the myth dignifies temple service by rooting it in sacred origin. The labour may be heavy, but at least now it has a mythic backstory with excellent dramatic branding. And still the mystery remains in what we cannot confirm. We cannot know exactly how every listener understood the blood of the god. Did it sound frightening, noble, familiar? Did it explain consciousness, duty, the uneasy feeling that human beings belong to the natural world and yet are never fully content to remain there? Most historians agree the text is myth, but myth is often where cultures hide their deepest psychological observations in plain sight. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. What's documented is that Mesopotamian creation tradition includes the striking idea of humans formed from clay mixed with divine substance. What may be interpreted is whether that image explains life, intellect, duty, or the contradictions of being human. And what if the old scribe pressing these lines into clay understood something you can still feel tonight? That whatever humanity was really made for in ancient imagination, it was never meant to be simple, because from the very beginning the story gives you hands of earth and a restlessness that seems to come from somewhere harder to name. That restlessness does not float freely for long, because it soon settles into buildings, rituals, schedules, and the steady authority of the institutions. If humanity is made for service in Mesopotamian myth, then the temple becomes one of the clearest places where that purpose takes shape. Most historians agree that temples in ancient Mesopotamia were not only religious sites, but also economic and administrative centres. Archaeology suggests that they stored goods, employed workers, organised offerings, managed land, and stood at the symbolic heart of urban life. What's broadly accepted is that the boundary between sacred and practical was far thinner there than many modern people expect. Prayer and bookkeeping were not awkward roommates. They lived together quite comfortably, probably under the same reed roof, arguing about grain. You can feel that the moment you walk into the temple precinct. Courtyards open in the heat. Storerooms hold jars and baskets. Workers move with purpose. Priests, attendants, labourers and scribes all form part of a system meant to sustain divine presence and civic order at the same time. Most historians agree that the gods in Mesopotamia were not imagined as distant abstractions. Their statues, rituals, and houses mattered materially. Offerings were prepared, garments were provided, hymns were recited. Temples embodied the relationship between the city and its deity. One interpretation is that this institutional setting helps explain why myths about human creation for service feel so practical. They do not emerge in a vacuum. They emerge in a world where service to the gods has visible architecture. A careful reading might suggest that the temple gives social form to the older creation stories. If humans were made to relieve divine burdens, then temple labour becomes a daily enactment of that ancient arrangement. Bread is baked, beer is poured, incense burns, vessels are cleaned, floors are swept, accounts are kept, animals are managed, textiles are prepared, and all of it happens under sacred logic. A more cautious explanation could be that myths and institutions reinforce each other. The myth dignifies the work, and the work keeps the myth alive. This is not proof of hidden manipulation. It is simply how cultures often function. Stories justify structures. Structures preserve stories. Everybody nods solemnly, and somebody still has to carry the barley. Historians still argue whether temple institutions in early Mesopotamia held primary control over economic life, or whether their importance has sometimes been overstated compared with households, local elites, and palace systems in later periods. There's no full consensus, especially across different cities and centuries. The evidence we do have points to variation. Some temples were enormously influential. Some periods saw palatial power increase. Some arrangements likely shifted with local politics and geography. But what's broadly accepted is that temples mattered deeply, both as sacred centres and as places where labour, authority and meaning met in very concrete ways. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real secret hidden inside these creation myths is not cosmic at all, but institutional? That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it deserves careful wording. One interpretation is that myths about why humanity was created may have helped people understand, accept, or sanctify the social demands placed upon them. If temple life sits at the centre of the city, if offerings support divine order, if labour sustains both family and cult, then a story. Saying humans exist to serve the gods does not merely explain the universe. It also explains why your week is full of obligations. The myth is not only metaphysical, it is organisational. That does not mean some cynical priest invented creation stories just to make everyone mop the floor more enthusiastically. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Cultures do not usually operate through single acts of deception. They grow through shared assumptions, rituals, and inherited meanings. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion was sincere within its own world, and archaeology suggests that temple ritual shaped identity, not just compliance. A more cautious explanation could be that the stories were believed because they fit lived experience. People saw order as fragile divine favour as necessary and service as part of reality. In that setting, the myth would not feel manipulative. It would feel true in the way a horizon feels true, always there, even when you do not stare at it. A fringe idea proposes that the temples themselves were centres of a hidden knowledge, preserving the literal history of the Anunnaki and humanity's engineered origin. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it lingers because temples are mysterious buildings by design. Elevated spaces, restricted rooms, rituals behind doors, specialised knowledge, scribal training, incense in the air. Honestly, if you wanted to invent a setting guaranteed to launch theories 3,000 years later, you would probably start with a Mesopotamian temple, and then add one locked chamber for dramatic effect. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more grounded point is that restricted knowledge and sacred performance naturally create an atmosphere where outsiders imagine secrets. Most historians agree, however, that the strongest evidence points to temples as religious and institutional centres within the normal fabric of ancient society, not as hidden archives of alternative history. The evidence we do have points to offerings, administration, storage, landholding, and ritual performance. One interpretation is that this practical sacredness may be exactly why the creation stories endure. They do not ask you to imagine distant metaphysics only. They root divine purpose in the repetitive material acts of daily life. Sweep this floor, bake this bread, record this ration, recite this hymn. Through such things the city holds. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know temples mattered. We know myths of divine service existed. We know institutions and stories shaped one another. What we cannot fully recover is the interior feeling of the ancient worshipper or worker. Did the myth of human purpose bring comfort, resignation, pride, a sense of belonging, or simply the weary acceptance that somebody somewhere always writes the schedule and then calls it sacred order? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. What's documented is that Mesopotamian temples organised ritual labour storage and authority in ways central to urban life. What may be interpreted is that creation stories about serving the gods helped give those demands a cosmic frame. And what if the old question of why humanity was really created feels so haunting? Not because the answer is hidden in a dramatic secret, but because the answer may have been standing in plain sight all along, built into brick courtyards offering tables and the quiet expectation that human hands were always meant to keep the world of the gods in working order. The trouble with old tablets is that they tempt you into confidence right before they remind you how much is missing. A line breaks, a sign is damaged. A word has several possible shades of meaning. A copy is made centuries after the story first took shape. Then a modern reader arrives full of coffee and determination, ready to extract one neat hidden truth from an archive that seems almost professionally designed to resist neatness. Most historians agree that translation and interpretation are central challenges in reading Sumerian and Akkadian texts. What's broadly accepted is that these languages come to us through damaged tablets, variant copies, specialised vocabulary, and long traditions of scribal transmission. Archaeology suggests that what survives is only a fraction of what once existed, so the mystery is real, but often in the most ordinary academic sense. The puzzle is not always a secret. Sometimes it is just a broken corner. That may sound less exciting than a lost cosmic revelation, but in its own way, it is more interesting. The evidence we do have points to a world of trained scribes, formal learning, repeated copying, and literary adaptation. Most historians agree that scribal schools preserved and transmitted important texts over long periods. One interpretation is that this tradition gave Mesopotamian myths their endurance, but also their complexity. A careful reading might suggest that what we call a creation story is often not a single fixed original, but a moving stream of retellings, arrangements, and emphasis. Ancient literature is less like a sealed vault, and more like a song taught across generations with slight differences each time, and everyone pretending that their version is obviously the normal one. Historians still argue whether certain key lines in creation and divine narratives should be translated with one nuance or another, and those choices can matter enormously. A word for labour may also imply service. A divine title may carry rank, kinship, or authority that does not map neatly into English. A damaged line may invite reconstruction, but reconstruction is never the same thing as certainty. There's no full consensus, and that is not failure. It is part of the discipline. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. This matters especially when people claim the tablets reveal a single hidden answer about why humanity was created. A more cautious explanation could be that the text reveals several overlapping answers, depending on which text, which period, and which interpretive lens you bring to them. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths are not uniform doctrine. What's broadly accepted is that they contain recurring themes, yes, but also variation. Divine labour, clay blood, service order, noise, flood, kingship, and judgment appear in different combinations and emphases. One interpretation is that the very act of trying to force them into one master theory tells you more about modern desire for certainty than about ancient belief itself. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the brokenness of the tablets is part of why the Anunnaki mystery keeps living? That is a possibility, not a certainty, but it feels persuasive. People are drawn to gaps. A completed text can be studied. A damaged one can be haunted. The missing piece invites imagination to move in and rearrange the furniture. A popular rumour claims that scholars are hiding explosive truths in obscure translations, or refusing to admit what the tablets plainly say. This theory isn't widely accepted, and usually the less dramatic explanation is better. Ancient languages are hard. Context matters. Experts disagree because the material is difficult, not because they all gather secretly at midnight to protect the Bali-based world order. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Scholarly disagreement is not evidence of conspiracy. That's a possibility, not a certainty about every debate, but it is the safer assumption by far. The evidence we do have points to normal academic realities, fragmentary texts, multiple copies, evolving philology, and careful caution where the record is uncertain. A fringe idea proposes that the oldest texts contain direct statements about engineered humanity that mainstream historians refuse to acknowledge. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because ambiguity feels suspicious to modern audiences. We like our mysteries theatrical. We do not enjoy hearing that the real answer may be, the tablet is cracked, the grammar is tricky, and nobody sensible should overstate this line. Most historians agree that some of the most powerful questions in Mesopotamian literature come from exactly those grey areas. What's broadly accepted is that myths were copied because they mattered, but what they meant could shift with context. A careful reading might suggest that ancient audiences themselves may not have demanded the kind of absolute clarity modern readers often want. Ritual and narrative can be meaningful without functioning like legal contracts. The story can shape a society even if nobody summarises it in one convenient sentence with a dramatic thumbnail arrow. And yet uncertainty does not make the text empty. Quite the opposite. The evidence we do have points clearly enough to recurring concerns. Humans are made. Work matters. Divine order exists. Boundaries between gods and people are negotiated through ritual and obligation. Creation carries purpose, but that purpose is not always comforting. Historians still argue whether the emphasis falls most strongly on labour-sacred service, political legitimation, or existential explanation. There's no full consensus, but the overlap itself is revealing. Ancient myths often hold several truths in tension at once, because human life does too. One interpretation is that modern fascination with the Anunnaki comes from a collision between ancient ambiguity and contemporary anxiety. We want origins explained. We want purpose clarified. We want the strange lines on old tablets to settle the feeling that life is structured by forces larger than ourselves. A more cautious explanation could be that the texts endure precisely because they do not settle that feeling. They dramatise it. They let the question breathe. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. What's documented is that reading Mesopotamian tablets involves fragmentary evidence, contested translations, and long scribal transmission. What may be interpreted is whether the gaps hide a lost doctrine or simply the normal incompleteness of the ancient record. And what if the real lesson of the broken tablet is not that someone hid the truth from you, but that history, like life, often arrives in pieces enough to show, a shape enough to stir the mind, and never quite enough to stop you from leaning closer into the dark. You lean closer into that dark, and the next thing you hear is not silence, but noise, which turns out to be one of the oldest human problems on record. In the Mesopotamian flood traditions, especially in Atrahasis, humanity does not merely work. Humanity multiplies, grows loud, and begins to disturb the divine order. Most historians agree that these flood stories developed over long stretches of Mesopotamian literary history, with themes and episodes appearing in different versions, including Atrahasis and later the flood material woven into the Epic of Gilgamesh. What's broadly accepted is that divine frustration with human noise plays a central role in some of these traditions. Archaeology suggests that the stories were copied and reworked across centuries, which means you are again dealing with a layered archive rather than one single frozen announcement from antiquity. At first, the complaint can sound almost funny. Humanity is too noisy. The gods cannot rest. It feels oddly domestic, like the universe itself is banging on the ceiling with a broom handle. But one interpretation is that the joke only works because it touches something more serious. A careful reading might suggest that noise in these stories is not just literal volume. It may point to population pressure disorder, social disturbance, or the sheer strain that increasing human activity places on a fragile world. A more cautious explanation could be that the myth uses sound as a vivid symbol for collective human disruption. Ancient literature likes to compress huge anxieties into one memorable image, and everyone is getting too loud is a surprisingly effective one. Most historians agree that southern Mesopotamian life depended on delicate balances, water control, crop timing, labour coordination, and the stability of urban institutions. Archaeology suggests that floods, salinization, environmental stress, and political change all shaped life in the region over long periods. The evidence we do have points to a civilization intensely aware of fragility. Order had to be maintained. Systems could fail. The city was an achievement, but never a guarantee. So when a myth says humanity became too noisy, one interpretation is that it reflects the anxiety of crowded, interdependent societies. Too many people, too much disruption, too little control. And suddenly the whole arrangement starts to feel one bad season away from collapse. Historians still argue whether the flood in Atrahasis should be read mainly as an environmental memory, a theological reflection on divine human tension, or a literary device for resetting cosmic balance. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty matters. The evidence we do have points in several directions at once. Flooding was a real feature of Mesopotamian river life. Social crowding was real. Theological concern with order was real. The myth may fold all three together. That often happens in ancient stories. They are not obligated to choose between symbolism and experience when they can simply put both on the same boat. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the complaint about noise is really about visibility? That is a possibility, not a certainty, but it is worth lingering over. A world with a handful of humans might feel manageable to the gods. A world thick with people, labour speech, births, rituals, complaints, and ambitions becomes something else. It becomes history. One interpretation is that the noise in the myth represents the moment human beings become impossible to ignore. They are not just workers now. They are a mass presence with consequences. A careful reading might suggest that the flood is less a punishment for sin in the later moralizing sense and more a drastic response to overcrowded existence. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian flood narratives differ from later traditions in important ways, even if there are thematic overlaps. What's broadly accepted is that the gods in these stories can appear divided, regretful, pragmatic, or inconsistent, rather than perfectly unified moral judges. One interpretation is that this gives the myths a distinctively political tone. Divine decisions resemble the uneasy choices of rulers trying to restore order in a complicated system. A more cautious explanation could be that the stories preserve older polytheistic logic where not all gods want the same outcome, and cosmic authority itself contains tension. Even heaven apparently can struggle with committee decisions. A fringe idea proposes that the flood traditions preserve a coded memory of deliberate depopulation by superior beings who had lost control of the human population they engineered. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because the old story already sounds like a management crisis written at mythic scale, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. The grounded observation is that the myth dramatizes a fear as old as cities themselves. What happens when the systems meant to sustain life become overwhelmed by life? That is not secret science fiction. It is social dread wearing sacred clothes. The evidence we do have points to a Mesopotamian imagination deeply concerned with balance. Humanity is needed. Humanity works. Humanity also expands, complains, and disrupts. Most historians agree that this tension sits near the heart of Atrahasis. One interpretation is that the myth does not simply explain why humans were made, but why their makers might later feel ambivalent. A more cautious explanation could be that the story reflects the everyday reality of large societies, where every solution creates new burdens. You solve the labour shortage, and eventually you discover you have invented neighbours. That ambivalence matters because it complicates the question of purpose. If humans were created to relieve divine work, yet later become a source of trouble, then purpose is not the same as approval. The old story does not say humanity was created because the gods adored the concept. It suggests something more practical and therefore more unsettling. You were made because you were useful. Whether usefulness guarantees affection is another matter entirely. Ancient myths are generous with symbolism, but not always with emotional reassurance. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. What's documented is that Mesopotamian flood stories, especially Atrahasis, connect human multiplication and noise with divine frustration and catastrophe. What may be interpreted is whether that noise symbolises literal disturbance, social crowding, environmental strain, or all three at once. And what if the most haunting detail is not the flood itself, but the complaint that comes before it? Because somewhere in that old line about human noise, there lingers a timeless fear that once people become numerous enough to fill the world with their needs, even the powers above may begin to wonder what exactly they started. That wondering has a long afterlife, and by the time it reaches the modern world, it has acquired rockets, conspiracies, television specials, and the kind of confidence normally seen only in men explaining maps at family gatherings. The ancient Anunnaki, once part of a shifting Mesopotamian religious vocabulary, begin to reappear as hidden visitors, lost engineers, cosmic rulers, or secret founders of civilization. Most historians agree that none of this belongs to mainstream interpretation of the Mesopotamian texts. What's broadly accepted is that the Anunnaki in ancient sources are divine beings within mythic and ritual frameworks, not extraterrestrials in disguise. Archaeology suggests that the modern fringe picture emerges much later, shaped by speculative writers' mistranslations, selective readings, and a wider appetite for hidden history narratives. So now you are no longer just walking through old temple courts. You are walking through the human habit of taking ambiguity and dressing it in chrome. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were advanced beings who came to Earth, influenced early civilization, and created humans as a labour force. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular for obvious reasons. It is dramatic. It simplifies a difficult archive. It makes ancient myths sound startlingly modern. Councils become command centres. Divine substance becomes biotech. temple economies become mining operations or colonization projects. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can at least see why it thrives. It turns fragments into a plot, and plots are easier to love than footnotes. Most historians agree, however, that these modern claims do not match the best supported reading of the texts themselves. The evidence we do have points to ancient religious traditions shaped by social, political ritual and literary concerns inside Mesopotamian culture. One interpretation is that fringe theories gain strength precisely where the historical record becomes complicated. A careful reading might suggest that modern audiences often confuse mystery with evidence. When a text is damaged, symbolic, or difficult to translate, it creates room for certainty to enter wearing a very dramatic coat. The calmer explanation is usually better. The ancient story is strange because myth is strange, not because someone left a technical manual in a temple and forgot to mention it for 4,000 years. Historians still argue whether modern fascination with the Anunnaki is best understood as pseudo-history myth-making pop spirituality or a psychological response to modern alienation. There's no full consensus on the cultural meaning of the trend, though there is broad agreement on the historical weakness of its claims. One interpretation is that people are drawn to these ideas because they promise external authorship. If life feels impersonal, hierarchical, and exhausting, then the suggestion that superior beings designed the system can feel oddly satisfying. A more cautious explanation could be that these theories are less about ancient Mesopotamia than about modern discomfort with ordinary explanations. Irrigation labour systems, scribal tradition and evolving religion are real, but they do not sparkle the way secret architects do. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if modern Anunnaki theories endure because they keep alive a feeling already present in the ancient texts, the feeling that human life is arranged by powers above it? That is a possibility, not a certainty, and it is worth separating from literal belief. You do not need extraterrestrials to understand why stories of distant rulers assigned purpose, labour and surveillance would resonate. Ancient myths and modern anxieties are shaking hands across a very large stretch of time. One interpretation is that fringe readings survive because they dramatise what many people already suspect in a non-literal way, that the system was built before they arrived and nobody bothered to explain the fine print. A popular rumour claims that scholars dismiss Anunnaki as alien theories only because the implications would overturn everything we think we know. This theory isn't widely accepted and the evidence is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Most historians agree that mainstream resistance to these claims has much less to do with fear and much more to do with method. Texts have context. Languages have nuance. Claims require support. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient myths deserve to be read first as ancient myths. That may sound less thrilling, but it actually gives them more dignity. They do not need to be smuggled into science fiction to be powerful. The evidence we do have points to a recurring problem in modern readings of the past. Symbolic language is flattened into literal reportage. Metaphor is treated like machinery. Theological hierarchy is translated into military rank. This happens not because people are foolish, but because modern habits of thought lean toward mechanism. If something sounds organised, we imagine a system. If a myth sounds procedural, we imagine technology. If ancient people say a being came from the heavens, half the room immediately starts designing a landing platform. Civilization has advanced in many ways, but our ability to overcommit to a dramatic interpretation remains beautifully undefeated. And still the mystery is not worthless, just because the popular theory is weak. One interpretation is that fringe readings preserve a real intuition even when they mishandle the evidence. They sense that the old texts are wrestling with questions of power, purpose, hierarchy, and dependence. Those are not trivial themes. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian myths often make humans seem small within a larger order. A careful reading might suggest that the emotional force of modern Anunnaki theories comes from exaggerating that smallness into cosmic subordination. It is less a historical insight than a mythic mood. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. What's documented is that mainstream scholarship does not support the idea of the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial creators of humanity. What may be interpreted is why that fringe theory became so compelling in the modern imagination, and what if the reason it keeps flickering back to life is not that it uncovers a hidden truth, but that it translates an old unease into a new costume. Because whenever people feel trapped inside systems too large to understand, they start looking upward and asking whether the names may have changed. But the question of who set the terms has really changed at all. That question lingers above everything now, because once you set aside the louder fringe claims and return to the tablets themselves, the old mystery becomes quieter and in some ways more unsettling. Why create anyone at all? Not why in a biological sense, not why in a modern philosophical seminar with expensive coffee and a whiteboard, but why in the logic of the Mesopotamian stories. Most historians agree that ancient creation myths often explain order suffering duty and the place of human beings within a structured cosmos. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian accounts do not treat humanity as accidental. People are made with a role, even if the role is not flattering. Archaeology suggests that these stories emerged in societies where labour, ritual and hierarchy were woven tightly together. So the question of purpose is never far from the question of who benefits when purpose is defined. You already know one major answer from Atrahasis and related traditions. Humans are created to take on labour. The gods, or some gods, are relieved. Order is maintained. Offerings continue. Cities endure. Most historians agree that this is one of the clearest themes in Mesopotamian creation literature. But one interpretation is that the story does something more than assign a task. A careful reading might suggest that it turns labour into destiny. Work is not merely what humans happen to do after appearing. Work is built into the explanation for why they appear in the first place. A more cautious explanation could be that the myth reflects a world where labour was so central that imagining humanity without it would have felt almost incoherent. In a society built on irrigation storage, cultivation, and ritual maintenance, the idea of a purposeless human may have sounded as odd as a temple without walls. Historians still argue whether these stories are best read as theological explanations, as social legitimation, or as symbolic reflections on the burden of existence itself. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty matters. The evidence we do have points to overlap. The myths can justify institutions and still express something psychologically deep. They can reflect power and still feel sincere. They can support hierarchy and still carry honest wonder. Ancient religion is rarely one thing at a time. It can be sacred truth, social glue, and emotional therapy, while also quietly reminding you that your grand cosmic role involves carrying water before sunrise. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the deepest issue is not labour alone, but usefulness? That is a possibility, not a certainty, but it may help explain the tone of these myths. The Mesopotamian stories do not usually imagine humanity as the centre of creation in a sentimental way. Humans matter, yes, but often because they serve a function within a larger order. One interpretation is that this gives the myths their stark power. You're not here because the universe simply wanted your company. You are here because order requires participants. A careful reading might suggest that the old stories are less interested in your individuality than in your place within a cosmic arrangement. That can sound bleak to modern ears, but it may have felt stabilising in its own setting. Most historians agree that ancient societies often understood personhood through relationships, household duties, and cultic roles rather than through modern ideals of self-expression. What's broadly accepted is that meaning often came from belonging to a structure, not escaping it. A more cautious explanation could be that the myths offered orientation. They told people where they stood in a fragile world of floods, harvests, rulers, and divine powers. If life is hard, then a defined place may feel better than a blank sky. Not cheerful perhaps, but comforting in the way a well-tied sandal is comforting when the road is mostly mud. A fringe idea proposes that the stories preserve a literal explanation for human function as a designed workforce, almost like a cosmic contract hidden under religious language. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains attractive because it feels brutally honest. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the stronger observation is that even mainstream readings acknowledge the practical emphasis. The difference is not whether labour matters, it clearly does. The difference is whether mythic purpose should be read as literal engineering or as symbolic theology shaped by social reality. The evidence we do have points much more strongly to the second path. Still, symbolism does not make the question less sharp. Why did ancient people keep telling stories in which humanity's purpose was tied to work, service, ritual, and maintenance? One interpretation is that these stories helped make burden bearable by explaining it. A more cautious explanation could be that they made burden sacred, which is not the same thing as making it pleasant. There is a difference between meaning and comfort, and Mesopotamian myth seems to understand that perfectly. The world asks much of you. The story tells you that this has always been so. Most historians agree that the sacred dimension of work mattered in temple economies. Archaeology suggests that offerings, rituals, and the care of divine houses were not side activities, but central practices. The evidence we do have points to a civilization where divine-human exchange shaped daily existence. So when creation myths imply that humans exist to serve the gods, that may not have sounded cynical. It may have sounded descriptive. One interpretation is that sacred duty and economic necessity were experienced as part of the same order. The bread on the table, the jar in the storeroom, the hymn in the temple, and the canal in the field all belong to one continuous fabric. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know these myths assign humans a place. We know that place involves labour and service. We know ancient society made those things unavoidable. What we cannot fully recover is whether people heard these stories with gratitude, resignation, irony, pride, or all four at once. Perhaps that ambiguity is why they remain so compelling. Even now, modern people still ask whether purpose is something discovered, assigned, negotiated, or imposed. The old tablets do not settle that debate, but they do show how early it began. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. What's documented is that Mesopotamian creation stories often frame humanity in relation to divine service labour and cosmic order. What may be interpreted is whether these stories mainly justify institutions or express a deeper meditation on usefulness itself. And what if the reason the tablets still feel so close tonight is that beneath all the clay gods and broken lines they are circling a question, you still recognise whether being made for something is a blessing, a burden, or simply the oldest way human beings have tried to explain why they keep rising each morning to do the work again. By now, you're close enough to the tablets to see the damage. The missing corners, the softened edges, the lines that survive just long enough to tempt you, and then fade into silence. And that, strangely enough, may be the clearest way to think about what these texts really hide. Most historians agree that Sumerian and broader Mesopotamian tablets conceal less through conspiracy than through age breakage, context loss, and the ordinary cruelty of time. What's broadly accepted is that thousands of texts survive, but many are fragmentary, many are administrative, many are difficult to date precisely, and many preserve only part of a larger literary tradition. Archaeology suggests that what appears hidden to modern readers is often simply incomplete. The clay did its best. History then dropped things, buried things, burned things, and generally behaved like a very careless archivist. That may sound almost disappointing at first. You come looking for the secret of why humanity was really created, and the first answer for the tablets is something like, well, half the sentence is missing. But one interpretation is that this incompleteness is not a weakness. A careful reading might suggest that the meaning of these texts survives not as one dramatic statement, but as a pattern repeated across myths, rituals, and social structures. The evidence we do have points to recurring themes. Humans are formed, assigned burden needed, and kept within a larger divine order. What is hidden is not necessarily a lost final line saying, "Here is the entire truth signed by the Anunnaki." What is hidden may be the way meaning emerges only when you place many partial pieces beside one another and resist the urge to panic when the picture is not finished. Most historians agree that ancient archives preserve different kinds of writing for different purposes. Some tablets count barley, some record contracts, some teach scribes, some preserve hymns, myths, prayers, royal inscriptions and lexical lists. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian civilization left behind an enormous written tradition, but not one designed for your convenience. One interpretation is that this variety matters because it prevents simplistic reading. A myth about creation does not stand alone. It belongs to a culture where administration, ritual, kingship, labour and theology all interact. A more cautious explanation could be that when modern readers isolate one dramatic passage and treat it like a complete worldview, they accidentally flatten the very civilization they claim to be uncovering. Historians still argue whether certain creation themes should be treated as central doctrines or as literary expressions among many others. There's no full consensus, especially because Mesopotamian religion developed over long periods and across different cities and empires. The evidence we do have points to continuity, yes, but also to adaptation. Sumerian traditions influence Akkadian texts. Old stories are copied in new settings. The names remain while the emphasis shifts. This is why the tablets can seem to hide things. Not because they were designed as a treasure map, but because they preserve a living tradition in motion. Trying to reduce that to one answer is a bit like trying to explain an entire orchestra by interviewing only the flute and then acting surprised when the drums object. What if the stories are pointing at something else? What if the tablets hide, meaning the way dreams hide meaning? Not by locking it away, but by refusing to say everything in plain daylight. That is a possibility, not a certainty, and we should keep it gentle. One interpretation is that ancient myths often reveal themselves indirectly. They use image repetition, divine drama, and ritual context rather than straightforward explanation. A careful reading might suggest that the real hidden thing is not a suppressed fact, but the relationship between the myth and the society that carried it. Humans were created for labour. Temples organised service. Cities depended on coordinated work. Flood stories worried about overgrowth and disorder. Divine councils mirrored power. Put these together and a larger pattern appears. Humanity in this world exists to sustain order under powers above it. That is not the same as proving a secret doctrine. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is a pattern, not a verdict. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Most historians agree that ancient texts must be read in context, and archaeology suggests that context includes environment, institutions, ritual practice, and scribal habit. The evidence we do have points toward a civilization preoccupied with maintenance. Fields must be watered, temples must be supplied, offerings must be performed, kings must be legitimated, the gods must be honoured. One interpretation is that the creation stories hide nothing more exotic than this, a world where being human means being necessary to the upkeep of order. A fringe idea proposes that the tablets once contained explicit statements about the Anunnaki's true intentions, but those statements were lost, erased, or deliberately obscured. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that the missing answers never existed in the direct form modern readers want. Ancient myths often do not end with explanatory neatness. They circle truths through narrative rather than spelling them out like a legal notice taped to a temple door. The old scribes were many things, but they were not writing FAQ pages. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot confirm one final hidden reason for humanity's creation written plainly in the clay. We can, however, see that the myths repeatedly connect human existence to bird in service ritual and cosmic structure. Most historians agree that this is the safest broad conclusion. One interpretation is that the tablets hide their meaning in accumulation. Not one line, but many. Not one god, but a system. Not one answer, but a mood. A more cautious explanation could be that this mood is exactly what keeps modern readers returning. The texts do not close the question, they preserve it. And there is something fitting in that. You sit with the tablet in your hands, real or imagined, and feel the grooves pressed by someone long gone. The clay is cool now, the city is gone, the temple dust has settled, the canals have shifted, yet the old question is still there, not because the ancients left a perfect secret behind, but because they left a pattern of concern that still feels uncomfortably familiar. Who does the work? Who sets the order? Who benefits from the arrangement? Why does purpose so often arrive wearing the clothes of duty? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. What's documented is that the tablets are fragmentary, context-dependent, and resistant to simple conclusions. What may be interpreted is that their surviving patterns point toward humanity as a necessary caretaker within a larger divine and social order. And what if what they really hide is not a lost announcement from the gods, but the quieter realization that ancient people like modern ones already understood something difficult and enduring? That the biggest truths are often not concealed in one forbidden sentence, but scattered in plain sight across the routines everybody learns to call normal. And so you arrive at the last tablet, or rather at the idea of a last tablet, because Mesopotamia rarely gives you a final page that closes with perfect elegance and a lantern gently dimming in the background. Most historians agree that Sumerian and broader Mesopotamian texts leave us with fragments, recurring themes, and carefully preserved traditions rather than one single master statement about humanity's purpose. What's broadly accepted is that these cultures imagine the world as ordered, populated by gods with rank and agency, and sustained through ritual labour and obligation. Archaeology suggests that the texts survive because generations of scribes found them worth copying, teaching, and preserving. The evidence we do have points to endurance, not certainty. That may be the most ancient feeling of all. People keep the story because it matters, even when it does not settle every question. If you look back across the clay, the canals, the temples, the divine councils, the blood-mixed creation, the labour burden, and the complaint about human noise, a pattern emerges. One interpretation is that Mesopotamian creation stories do not reveal a hidden secret in the dramatic modern sense. A careful reading might suggest that they reveal an old world view in which human beings exist inside a structure they did not design under powers. They do not control, carrying duties that feel both practical and sacred. A more cautious explanation could be that the myths answer the question of why humanity was created by linking people to maintenance itself. Humans are here to keep order going, to grow, carry, build, offer, repair, remember and endure. Oh, Historians still argue whether that pattern should be read mainly as theology, as social reflection, as institutional reinforcement, or as a poetic meditation on the burden of being human. There's no full consensus, and it is worth ending with that honesty rather than pretending otherwise. The evidence we do have points to overlap. The stories can dignify labour and also naturalise it. They can explain suffering and also justify structure. They can express wonder and still place human life firmly beneath divine authority. Ancient myths are generous that way. They offer meaning, but they do not always offer flattery. You are important, yes, but often in the same way a well rope is important. Necessary, heavily used, and not especially consulted about the schedule. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki myths preserve literal hidden knowledge about advanced creators and humanity's engineered purpose. This theory isn't widely accepted, and after walking through the stronger historical ground, you can probably feel why. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more persuasive mystery lies elsewhere. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the enduring power of the Anunnaki and the creation myths is not that they hide a secret technology, but that they preserve an old emotional truth? Human beings often feel made for systems larger than themselves. We inherit duties. We wake inside structures already running. We work, contribute, complain, multiply, make noise, ask questions, and hope that the order surrounding us has some meaning beyond mere exhaustion. Most historians agree that this kind of reading stays closer to the spirit of the sources than modern cosmic speculation does. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian religion and literature grew from the realities of floodplain, agriculture, temple economy, kingship ritual, and scribal culture. One interpretation is that the myths transform those realities into cosmic language. A careful reading might suggest that when the tablets speak of gods needing labour, humans being fashioned from clay, and divine order depending on service, they are not hiding from history. They are speaking through it. The ancient people of Mesopotamia knew what it meant to live in a hard world that only held together because someone kept working. Their myths simply raise that condition to the level of heaven. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot confirm one final concealed reason humanity was created. We cannot reduce the Anunnaki to a single role or force the tablets into one verdict. But we can see the shape that remains. Most historians agree that in these stories humans are purposeful beings, tied to labour obligation ritual and the upkeep of order. One interpretation is that this may be the closest thing the tablets offer to an answer. Not that humanity was secretly designed for one hidden task, but that ancient people understood existence itself through service to a world already in motion. And now the pace softens. The tablet grows cooler in your hands. The reed lamps burn lower. The city that felt so hot and crowded begins to recede into the distance, not vanishing entirely, but settling into that quiet place where history becomes almost like weather still there, just farther off. You no longer need the final answer to stand upright in front of you. It is enough perhaps to know that the people who shaped these stories were asking questions very much like your own, only in the language of clay and gods and floodwater and bread. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and in that soft boundary between what can be known and what can only be wondered about, the old texts keep breathing. They do not command you to believe one thing. They simply let you sit beside a very old puzzle and feel its edges. So you let the temples dim. You let the canals go silver under the night. You let the names of the gods drift upward and become less like answers and more like echoes. The Anunnaki, the clay, the labour, the noise, the broken lines, all of it grows gentler now. Whatever humanity was really created for in those ancient stories, the question has lasted longer than kingdoms, longer than walls, longer than the hands that pressed the signs into wet earth. And maybe that is enough for tonight. Maybe it is enough to rest with the thought that people have always tried to understand why they are here, and that the oldest stories did not always promise comfort, but they did offer shape and rhythm, and a place to set the burden down for a moment. So the last tablet does not close with certainty. It closes with quiet, with clay cooling in the dark, with a city sleeping beyond the river reeds, with your questions softening not because they have all been answered, but because they no longer need to press so hard. Let the old world fade now. Let the fan hum. Let the night hold the rest.